Great. Thanks again to everybody for showing up. It's really exciting to be able to do this training. We had originally planned on doing a series of in-person trainings around the country. We had an transparency science fair plan for this week. I think some of you had RSVP'd for that. It's a bummer not to be able to do that, but it's great to be able to do something. This is Sunshine Week. For those who don't know, this is the week every year that people celebrate transparency, try to, look for ways to kind of open government and also talk through public records and that sort of thing. And so it's great to be able to sort of bring that to the virtual world and with this training. So this training will be recorded so that other people who weren't able to make this time can join in. So keep that in mind, but otherwise, if you have questions, please ask them in the Q&A panel. I'll try to address everything. And I did thank you so much for everybody who did put in questions they had into the initial registration form. I tried to add a bunch of those to the presentations. Really, really great set of questions. And I'll try to tackle as many as I can and happy to kind of field anything else that comes up. Before we get too deep into this, if you're looking for other ways to kind of experiment with or get involved with Sunshine Week this week, we are partnering with the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press, which is a really wonderful organization that does a lot of pro bono litigation, a lot of reporting aid focused on Sunshine Week. And so tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern, there's going to be a Twitter chat. It's going to be moderated by our very own Beryl Lipton. And the hashtag is just Sunshine Chat 2020. So if you're on Twitter and you're looking for something to do, please tune into that and ask questions, share your perspectives. I think it's going to be a really, really good time. So yeah, that's just a little bit to get started. A little bit of background. So I work at MuckRock. We're a transparency nonprofit. We're based in a bunch of different cities now. We have folks in North Carolina, Detroit, Boston, and we work all around the country. We run a website called MuckRock that helps file, track, and share public records requests. We've helped file about 77,000 requests so far. So we do both federal Freedom of Information Act requests as well as state and local public records requests. And we've helped release just under 5 million pages of records in the past. So anything that can go right and sort of anything that can work successful, we've seen. We've also seen how things can go wrong in the public records process. We've also dealt with 15,000 agencies, and so we've got a pretty good sense of sort of the wide range of different types of responses and tactics that can work, and happy to share anything we can that can be useful for you. And we also work in all 50 states. So there's the Federal Freedom of Information Act. There's also individual state and local public records laws, and we've dealt with a lot of those. And so we have a good sense of the range of stuff that is out there. In addition to MuckRock, we run and work with a bunch of different services. We also run a site called FOIA Machine that is sort of a free public records tracking tool. We run OTranscribe, which is a free transcription tool. We run Document Cloud that helps analyze and host public records. About 3,000 newsrooms use that to post their primary source documents. Earlier this year, we combined with Outlier Media in Detroit. That's a really wonderful editorial organization that is focused on sort of understanding information needs in communities around the country. And so you can see that those sort of changes appearing already in our editorial work, which has been really, really exciting. So typically we do this as a very interactive in-person session. Because this is virtual, the logistics of that were a little more challenging. But what we did try to do is incorporate a lot of your really wonderful questions throughout the presentation. And I can't thank enough all the people who had really great questions, even some really basic ones. So somebody just said, I'm a beginner and I'm so ignorant that they don't even know what to ask. And that's absolutely fine. I think we hope this presentation will be useful for folks who've never filed a public records request before and people who filed hundreds of requests before. When I started MuckRock 10 years ago, I'd only filed 3 public records requests. None of them went anywhere. And so eventually you do get the hang of it. And one thing we do like to say is that public records is a little bit like a muscle. It really helps to kind of practice and build that up. And so building good public records habits is really key. And that just starts with just starting to file that first request, even if it's not perfect, even if it doesn't sort of break up any big stories. Just getting into the habit of filing public records requests and being curious about how this process works is going to be really, really valuable starting place. Another question we got a lot over the past week is just, has COVID-19 ground public records to a halt? Which is a really good question, right? So as sort of agencies sort of shift their resources to sort of responding to this crisis, there's a lot of debate of sort of, there's not a whole lot of solid information right now, quite frankly, about sort of the impact of this epidemic on sort of public records processing. We are starting to see some agencies, like in Chicago, City Hall put out an edict that said, hey, public records are non-essential right now. We're just going to stop processing. And they were just rejecting all requests. And that's sort of like the worst case scenario, is agencies just say, we're not even going to accept requests. Excuse me. We're not going to process requests, and just kind of rejecting them overall. There was actually a happy ending to that story. However, because after some outcry, after public pushback on that policy, Chicago did come back and sort of say, okay, we are going to continue to process requests. I do think you're going to see a lot of a slowdown in a lot of places when it comes to handling public records requests. We're seeing more and more agencies kind of send folks home saying, be safe. We're only allowing essential personnel in and that sort of thing. Different jurisdictions and different agencies are going to handle that very differently. And so I think it's something to keep an eye on. One resource I'm going to be talking a couple of times about throughout this presentation is there's a group called the National Free Information Coalition. It is made up of local coalitions, organizations across the country that are focused on public records and open meetings laws. So if you're really interested in what's going on in your state, those are all a really good local resource for understanding, are there shifts happening with public records laws? Are agencies trying to use this as a way to kind of skirt the law? And particularly, are open meetings laws seeing some curtailments? Because right now in Tennessee, for example, we're seeing some really troubling pushes to sort of say, oh, we're going to move to all electronic meetings and we're going to cut off public access. Now, moving to electronic, staying safe, that's really important. But what we don't want is agencies to use this as an excuse to sort of say the public will no longer be allowed access to these meetings at all. And so, excuse me, look for those local resources, look for opportunities to kind of pay attention to what's going on and sort of figure things out. But by and large, public records is continuing on. We're seeing a lot fewer commercial requests into agencies. And so some FOIA officers I've talked to said actually what they're seeing is a big reduction in requests that are incoming. And so in some cases, you might actually see improved response times, but that's really going to vary agency to agency and jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Excuse me. So here's the basic flow of this presentation. First, we're going to just talk through what is FOIA at a very basic level. We're going to talk about what to request. One of the things people first sort of when they find out about public records, you can say, oh, this is amazing. This is a really cool law. What can I even ask for? I think that's a really big question. Then we're going to talk through actually writing the request and sort of what language you should use, how to sort of think about strategy and wording. Then we're going to talk about follow through and sort of how to actually continue to follow up on your request, what to do to kind of continue pinging agencies, how can you appeal a rejection, and even talk about the very basics of litigation. And then we'll talk through some specific COVID-19 issues, as well as give a chance for people to ask questions in the Q&A forum and that sort of thing. So let's start with what is a free information request to begin with, right? Because I think it's a very basic question, but I think it's also a really important one to make sure, because at its heart, a Free Information Act was a law that was passed in the 60s and 70s and kind of amended, but it allows access to records, right? And so I think one of the first things that first-time requesters or early requesters get really hung up on is, sort of like, oh, I can ask the government questions. Well, not really. And the reason I use that sort of Jeopardy gift is because that you can ask for whatever you want, but it has to be in the form of a records request. And you have to ask for a record, right? You can't say how many people were murdered in this town or how many dogs live in this town or a question like that. You have to figure out how to phrase your question in the form of a document or a record that already exists within that agency. And so say I want a copy of death certificates within that town. That's a records request. I want a copy of all their dog registration data. That is a records request. And so as you're thinking through what questions or issues you care about in your community, one of the keys to being a really good records requester is sort of thinking through how do I transform those questions into sort of documents that are going to answer my questions. Generally speaking, FOIA laws allow the public access to records unless, so the typical default position is disclosure, unless those records are specifically exempt. Now, there are some very broad exemptions. But typically you're allowed to sort of ask for, anything, and then the government has to defend why it won't release that. Typically speaking, everybody is allowed access to all those records. And so at the US level, there is no restriction. You don't have to be a citizen. You don't have to live in the US. There are some states that bar out-of-state residents. There are places that bar minors. Louisiana doesn't allow anybody under the age of 18 to ask requests. Many states have restrictions on sort of people who are incarcerated from filing public records requests, but this is a very broad law. And relatively speaking, there's few restrictions on who can file requests with those major exceptions. One thing to know is that generally speaking, it doesn't allow you to just ask questions. And some agencies are prohibited by policy or by law from even explaining those records. Now, a lot of times they'll be more flexible about that, but I've had agencies come back to me and say, under the law, I can't explain what this record means. I can only provide it to you. I think that's a very literalistic reading of interpretation of the law, but it's something to keep in mind. A little more background on the law. So as we said, these laws were first passed into law in 1966. It was very grudgingly signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Here he is enjoying some downtime with his grandson and his dog. But this was something that there was a lot of pressure in terms of more government openness. The president was like, really, I just don't want to get this into law. And so he actually signed it on his private estate. There was no public ceremony or anything. And he kind of felt politically pressured into signing this, but it was something that they were really not in favor of. And those initial laws, they were a good step, but there wasn't a whole lot of process to actually kind of enforce those laws. And so we really have Richard Nixon to sort of thank for the bipartisan sort of support of actual enforcement of public records laws. Post-Watergate, we added the Privacy Act, which let people request records on themselves. And it provided a lot more litigation teeth and a lot more sort of enforcement powers to actually get records out there. So 1966, 1974, technically there was a law, but there wasn't a whole lot of power behind it. That's also, we got the 9 major exemptions. Most of them were put in place at that time, including one catch-all exemption called B3, which says that if something is exempt based on another law outside of the FOIA, that's also exempt material. State public records laws, most of them came after this, right? So most of them were also in the 60s and 70s. Most of them were modeled on a federal law. At the federal level, we have a lot of sort of special fee categories and fee waivers. Very, very few states have something analogous. So they're kind of loosely based on the federal law. What we've generally found is that state and local public records access is usually a lot quicker, but laws are less consistently applied, right? So at the federal level, there's a lot of bureaucracy. That means a lot of consistency. That means there's a lot of process and disinterested parties. At the local level, a lot of local jurisdictions don't have like full-time FOIA officers, for example. And so if you A lot of times we'll see agencies tend to just make up exemptions or they don't know the law as well at the local level. So it can be a little bit more Wild West. We have detailed state guides for each state's laws at muckrock.com/place. Pictured is our former FOIA fellow with our FOIA law t-shirt with some of the different laws. So one of the other things to know is that at the federal level, it's the Freedom of Information Act. Each state has its own law. My favorite is Utah's GRAMA, the Government Record Access and Management Act. Utah's is the Open Public Records Act. And so you have some really fun, creative nicknames. But you do want to make sure when you're filing a request with the state, make sure you cite the correct law. Because particularly police departments tend to get a little particular about making sure you're citing the right law. And if you say, I'm filing a Freedom of Information Act request in Florida, they will happily correct you and say, this is actually a sunshine request, and that sort of thing. One of the first questions, so I put all the questions with these fun little question logos here. One of the first questions we got was, how long do agencies have to fill requests? It's a really good question. So at the federal level, they have 20 days, but they can ask for an extension. But the reality is federal agencies very, very rarely meet that statutory deadline. At the local level, it really varies a lot. I think the shortest deadlines are like 2 or 3 days in some states. Other jurisdictions, such as Massachusetts, have more complicated deadlines depending on how complex the request is and sort of how much material asking for and how big the size of the agency is. But usually most deadlines are within a couple of weeks, but agencies actually complying with that varies a lot more. And so it really kind of depends on sort of which agency you're filing with and if you care about what the law says versus what the actual agency response time is. If you go to muckrock.com/place, that link at the bottom there, prominently up top, we have average response times for each state plus at the federal level. And if you click into a given state, you can see what the law actually says. So somebody answered a question. Jason asked, do you have a list of where the shortest wait times are or which locales are the most responsive? I don't off the top of my head have that, but if you go to muckrock.com/place, you can see which states are the quickest. There'll be the green states up top, and that'll help you get that answer. And then you can click in to sort of see what the actual laws are. So thank you. Another question that came up, and we'll kind of talk a little about this later. Alan asks, is there a statute of limitations on FOIA, and can I refile a request if I get rejected? That's a really great question. Generally speaking, no. Some agencies will try to say we've already rejected this request before, but generally speaking, if you file a new request, they have to process it. Some states do have rules around nuisance requests and that sort of thing, but generally speaking, there's not really a statute of limitations on FOIA. And we'll talk about some related things that do have some limitations. Great questions. So we've talked about the basics of FOIA. We talked about the basics law. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of what to research and what to request, which I actually think is really one of the most important parts of the FOIA process. How to turn your request, your questions into records ideas, right? Because you can't just come out and ask, hey, I want to know about this. You have to sort of figure out what are the records that are going to answer the questions you have. And that one of the questions we got was, any tips on how to find already declassified or published information? Because the reality is that there's a lot of stuff that's already out there. And if you can find the information already online without having to file a request, you're going to get a response much faster, right? I think if you can Google something, if you can find something on their website, you're going to get a response within minutes or even seconds versus waiting days, weeks, or months with a public records request. So we'll talk about that. One of the keys to sort of getting into sort of a sense of filing good public records requests is sort of thinking, what would a middle manager do, right? And so think through, like, if you're interested in a question, if you're interested into an issue, What would somebody on the other side of the equation, how would they manage this, right? A lot of us come into issues, into the process with sort of the mindset of a reporter: who, what, where, why. You know, but if you can take off that sort of reporter's hat or that activist hat or that researcher's hat and really sort of think like, okay, I'm really interested in this topic. If I worked at that agency, how would I control this program? What are the reports that I would need filed? What are the documents I would need to have people sign off on to make this happen? And really starting to try to, whenever possible, think through, you know, sort of putting yourself in the other side's shoes will go a long way towards sort of starting to think through what are the kinds of categories of documents that are going to be useful. So as we're thinking about what would a middle manager do, right? I think just thinking through the categories of records that they find valuable. Mandatory reporting, right? I think one thing that's true in government is that everything needs to be signed off on, everything needs to have a form. And so using that for your advantage. Most government activity requires putting something in writing, right? And if somebody's going to shut down your utilities, somebody needs to fill a form. They need to fill a form when they authorize that shutdown. They need to fill a form to let people know that it was actually shut down, all this other stuff. Procedure and process, right? I think if you're going to run a large-scale government-scale program, you need documentation for how that works. And so thinking through what are the training materials that this agency would generate? What are the procedures and process that are going to be placed? Do they have like an internal presentation where if they're saying like, hey, we're going to have a new policy where we're delivering a puppy to every house? Do they have a presentation where they talk through like, okay, here's how we're going to requisition puppies. Here's how we're going to make sure that everybody stays safe as they're delivering these puppies. Whatever that program is that you're interested in, there's going to be presentations, training materials, questions, process that goes into place. One of the other things to kind of also be on the lookout for is just paying really close attention to the specific wording that officials use when they talk about programs that you're interested in. So if the mayor is saying, hey, I'm getting daily reports from the Corona task force, you now know that there's daily reports being generated. If the supervisor says, hey, according to our most recent data, cases seem to be on the decline, then you know that there is data. And so you can say, hey, the supervisor mentioned this data. I would like a copy of the data used for this assessment. And then in collaboration, right? And so one of the other things is that a lot of times government agencies very rarely do things in a vacuum. A lot of times they're dependent on other agencies. And so look for sort of like, okay, if the mayor says he's working with the police department on this, they're going back and forth with that information. And so that's a really useful thing when they're going back and forth on stuff. Everybody wants to put things in writing because nobody wants to be the one left holding the bag at the end of the day. Another good question we got: how to know what question to ask for? How do I know what reports or daily briefings, et cetera, are called and exist, right? A lot of times government really feels like a black box because we're on the outside, we have questions, but we don't know the forms that agencies use. We don't know sort of what are the documents that this agency actually has. So we might think, hey, I just want your coronavirus data, but agencies might think, well, that could mean a whole variety of things. And so figuring out how do you get inside that sort of black box of government bureaucracy is a really, really important question. I apologize. I'm going to be back in 20 seconds. I'm just going to get some water. Very sorry about that. I've got a cough myself, and so trying to stay on top of things. Right, so this is a real challenge. When we're on the outside, knowing what to ask for, it can be really difficult to sort of get inside the mind of an agency. But there's a lot of resources out there for starting to get into that, starting with an agency's own website, and we'll go more in depth into some of these resources right now. So first of all, if you're interested in sort of coming up with a targeted request for an agency, first place to look is just go to their website. More and more agencies are proactively posting documents that are frequently requested. And you can go kind of through this and sort of see what other kinds of information have they previously released, what kind of forms does that agency have, and a whole wide variety of really interesting stuff that can help give you ideas for requests. At the federal level, every federal agency is required what's called an electronic reading room, where they're supposed to post any documents that are requested 3 or more times. That's a very valuable resource because you can see what other requesters are getting. But even local agencies, a lot of times they'll say, hey, if you're a local business, make sure to file this kind of inspection report, or you need to go for this kind of registration. Anytime an agency is asking for forms or asking for other information, that's a great opportunity to kind of see how they refer to this documentation. And that can be really, really valuable as a requester. Another great opportunity to kind of get inside the head of an agency is just looking at agency records retention schedules and their systems of records, right? I think one of the things that agencies kind of really get caught up in their own bureaucracy, their own acronyms. And so if you ask for like, hey, I want a database of any crashes that you have, that agency might be, well, we don't have a database of crashes. If you go through the records retention schedule, this talks through all the different categories of documents that an agency is required to keep and for how long they're supposed to keep them. And this gives you a bunch of really useful, valuable information. For one thing, you now know, hey, this is what this agency actually calls stuff. So here's a look at the FAA's retention schedule, and you can see they have the accident incident database system, right? This gives you all sorts of different ideas for very, very specific things to request. It also gives you more leverage, right? Because when you can go to the agency and says, according to your agency's records retention schedule, you have to keep accident incident database systems for 3 years. I want 3 years worth of this data. The agency can say, okay, we'll give you 3 years of data, but they can't say, oh, we don't have that. Because if they say we don't have that, that means they're not following the records retention schedule, and that's legally going to create problems for them. One of the things as a requester is you're always looking for leverage against the agency, right? And if you're smart and you kind of pick up ticks and tactics, you can actually get that leverage. And that can seem really challenging because agencies are big, they're bureaucratic, they've got all the time in the world. And so looking for opportunities to kind of say, hey, according to this, you're supposed to keep this, that gives you a lot of opportunities to file good requests. Thank you for all the great questions so far. I will try to get back to them later, and I'll try to work into them when we're talking on those topics. But I am seeing them, so thank you for sending them. One last thing about records retention schedules. Each federal agency has its own records retention schedules. Most agencies post them on their website. The National Archives has pretty up-to-date records retention schedules for every agency as well. And so those can be very valuable resources. At the state level, yeah, somebody asked about local agencies have records retention schedules as well. So at the state and local level, usually those are set at the state level. Some localities have them, but it's usually sort of the Secretary of State will usually maintain these records retention schedules. So for pretty much any state, you can type in like Massachusetts Records Retention Schedule PDF and just Google that, and then usually it'll be 1 or 2 or 3 big PDFs that'll come up, and you can kind of search through those. Some states have multiple records retention schedules for like state agencies versus local agencies, or like big agencies versus small agencies, that sort of thing. But those are usually set at the state level for state and local, and then federally for each agency. Great question. Somebody, I'm not sure if this is a question there. But somebody mentioned subject matter lists from New York. Yeah, this is a great suggestion. I'm just going to copy this in there. This is from Raymond. I'm just going to copy this into the text. But basically, New York has something where each agency comes up with its subject matter lists. And this can be really, really useful for requesters, right? And so I wanted to share that to everybody. Sorry. Okay. So we got a few years ago, somebody used MuckRock to file a request for like New York City Police Department's subject matters list. And New York City Police is incredibly hard to get anything out of. And there, if you have these subject matter lists, you've got basically every form number that this agency has. You can file super, super specific requests, and these are really valuable, similar to the records retention schedules in other states. Great. And then Raymond just sent in, here's a link to the definition. I don't know if these questions are going back out to everybody, so I'm just pasting that in there, but thank you so much for sharing that. Another place to get ideas for what to request from agencies is just seeing what other requesters have done. I think as I was starting out as a requester, one of the most valuable things for me was seeing other people's requests and getting ideas for other requests, and then also kind of reverse engineering other people's requests. So if you read a news story from another town or another agency, and it says, according to public records documents, always just as a little exercise, try and think through, like, what do they actually request to get this information? And then on MuckRock, most of the requests filed through our platform are actually public. And so what you can do is you can just go to muckrock.com/FOI for free information and sort of search through other requests that people have filed. You can search by state, agency, keyword, whole different variety of ways to kind of explore different requests on the platform and get ideas for sort of like, oh, this person got some really interesting documents out of their city. Maybe I'll file the same request to my town as well. If you click onto an agency's name and on MuckRock, we'll also show you recently filed public requests from that agency. And so you can get an idea of sort of like what have other things been released from that agency. We also, a few years ago, we merged with a platform called Document Cloud. Document Cloud is sort of an open source document repository. Newsrooms contribute verified documents to it. And so if you're trying to get an idea of sort of what documents out there exist, Document Cloud is really, really valuable in terms of just sort of like, hey, I'm interested in like school lunch policies. You can type in some keywords on Document Cloud and see what have other people gotten in the past and get ideas of like specific types of forms, specific types of documents that also might be valuable. One of the other neat things about Document Cloud is that it also includes links to related reporting. So if you see a document and you're like, I'm having a hard time understanding what this actually means, you can click through that document and see that document in the context of a larger story, which can give you some really good ideas for records requests right off the bat. Somebody was asking earlier about response times. There's another service called FOIA Mapper I really like a lot. What they do is they kind of comb through public agency data, and they've got a few really good resources, I think. Yeah, so they got a few really good resources. One of them is they just have, they go through agency annual reports, and they look for average response times in terms of how long does the agency say simple requests, complex requests take. Which is really helpful in terms of gauging sort of like, okay, how long should I actually wait? Or how bad is it if my request actually gets labeled as complex? One of the other things they have that I personally think is super, super cool is information systems. There's systems of records or government record systems, a bunch of different acronyms that basically mean like, what are all the different databases that government agencies keep? After a lawsuit by the Sunlight Foundation 6 or 7 years ago, I think, all agencies were required, or most agencies were required to start posting sort of their database of databases. And so this means that you can go into agencies and sort of say, hey, here are all the different database types that this agency has. I want a copy of that database. So if you're into data, if you're into like big amounts of numbers and that sort of thing, this can be a really good idea to kind of go in and sort of like spent nuclear files. Like that sounds really cool. Natural gas import-export cases. Like there's all this fascinating data. And in a lot of cases, nobody has actually kind of gone through and requested this information from before. And so FOIA Mapper, if you're trying to get a sense of like what the database is and what data systems an agency has, FOIA Mapper is a really great resource for that. Google, another really great resource. If you haven't checked out this website before, highly recommend it, google.com. One of the things that's really helpful is a lot of people know that you can sort of limit search results to just one website or just a domain. Mixing and matching that with the file type restriction search can be really, really valuable for FOIA requesters. So for example, I've got that search query up there, housing site:.gov, so it only returns government results, file type: PPT. This is only going to return PowerPoint files because most of government runs on PowerPoints and PDFs. And a lot of times government agencies don't even realize all the different PowerPoints and PDFs that they're posting online. 6 or 7 years ago, we were using this technique and we found out that the Marine Corps had accidentally posted its entire intranet file online. And so there was just massive amounts of unclassified but really interesting documents all posted and available via just a quick Google search. If you're interested in a specific agency, I highly recommend just taking that agency's name, not even putting a keyword up front, just putting like site:agency.gov or whatever that agency's website is, file type: PPT, PDF, PPTX, XLS, and just seeing what files come up. And a lot of times some really fascinating documents can come back, and maybe they have like a blank form where it's like, if you're a bank and you're looking for a bailout, fill out this form, or whatever else there is. That as a requester can give you so many great ideas for requests. And also sometimes you'll just find documents that nobody's seen before because the agency posted it and nobody looked at it. And that works with or without keywords. So highly recommend using that technique. Now, hopefully this is giving you some ideas for sort of thinking through where to look for request ideas. Now it comes time to actually write the request. Somebody asked, will this video be available later? Yes, we will post this video onto MuckRock.com later, and I think we're gonna mention it in the newsletter if you haven't subscribed to the newsletter. So yeah, this is all being recorded, and so if there's anything you wanna review later, it'll be there. And you can also email me and I'm happy to share the presentation directly. So somebody asked, when submitting search terms, is it better to be broad or narrow? Which is a really good question. And I think this is something that there's a fair amount of debate on. My general review is that your request should be as specific as you can make them without leaving lots of documents out, right? The answer is always kind of, it depends, which is a frustrating answer, but I usually err on the side of being more specific, right? Because when you file a very broad request, what happens is the agency immediately puts up its guard. It immediately sort of says, oh, you're asking for everything. We're going to find everything in the kitchen sink we can throw back at you to find a way to deny your request. But if you start your request very narrow, all of a sudden you're getting more information. So maybe you're interested in a database. I usually start with just asking for one record from that database. Because if you can get that one record, you can see, is this an electronic database? Is this a paper database? Is information clearly segregated? And you have so much more data that goes into sort of, that you can use sort of like when you're in negotiation. Future releases, versus if you start asking for everything and start negotiating down, you've already started a very confrontational process with the agency, and they're going to be suspicious and they're not going to want to leave any ground. So I find agencies are a lot easier to work with when you're starting with something that's sort of simpler and more specific. I go to a lot of FOIA officer conferences. I'm actually on the board of the American Society of Access Professionals, ASAP, which is a FOIA officer trade organization. It's a really great group. And so when I'm hanging out with FOIA officers, their number one complaint, and this isn't because they don't like transparency, they actually do love transparency, but their number one complaint is requests for any and all documents about X, because that asks them to make a judgment call. That asks them to sort of just like search through and read every document that the agency has. And they feel like that's a very challenging thing. And so the more you can make your request specific, the easier it is going to be for the agency to fulfill that request. So things I recommend including in every request, citing the proper law, right? So if you're filing a federal request, say I'm filing a Freedom of Information Act request. Some states don't actually require you to cite the law, but it's always a best practice. Include enough detail for the agency to locate that information. It's very easy to kind of underestimate how complex agencies are and overestimate how organized agencies are. And so you want to sort of make sure that that agency, whoever receives that request, make sure they have enough detail to sort of understand, okay, if this is the first step on that request process, where should they task out that request to next? If you have the name of the document, for example, that's going to be really helpful. Who has that document, right? So if you're filing a Freedom of Information Act request and you know that a specific office was dealing with this, or if like this PR person or the spokesperson for the agency said, oh, we're getting all these reports about people no longer like puppies in our town, mention that spokesperson in your request and say, so-and-so mentioned this document, or I believe that this office would understand what these documents are. Because a lot of times the people on the front line receiving those requests, they might not know what's going on in sort of the broader news ecosystem or know what is sort of the big news of the day. And so anything you can do to kind of help them point internally that request in the right direction is going to go a long way. And that includes references to the record by the agency or news media. So there's been a number of studies at this point that have found that requests that have links in them get fulfilled more quickly and get more responsive documents. And so, and that's not because like agencies just really like clicking on hyperlinks. It's because by sending them a link to a news release or by sending a press release or whatever else, that makes it much easier for the agency to kind of like get a good frame of reference for that records request. So anytime, and you can include a relevant link so that that agency might better identify those documents or better identify the issue you're talking about, it's going to go a long way towards getting your request fulfilled. There's also some things that requests should not include. I've seen some requesters have like 10-page templates. Or a lot of times you'll see nonprofits when they're filing requests, they're filled with a ton of legalese. It's like 4 pages of like background material. Most requests should be under 1 page. I think a lot of times requesters, I think we see a lot of times these sort of like big long requests. We spend a lot of time sort of playing around with our template at MuckRock. The biggest challenge agencies a lot of times have is they don't know what the person is actually asking for, right? And so just trying to keep your request concise and try to think of it as like, if you get like a very specific, clear ask from your boss or your manager and they say, hey, can you do this for me? That's great. If somebody sends you like a 10-page letter with a lot of preamble and a lot of sort of details, that's going to be a much harder ask for you to process. And you're probably going to sort of like mentally sort of delay actually getting around to reading through it all because it's just a lot of work figuring out what they're asking for in the first place. So do cite the law, but don't cite every possible law. If something's not directly relevant to your request, don't try to bury the agency in legalese. I think ends up hurting more requests than ends up helping. And don't forget that there's a human on the other side of the process, right? So even if you think the government is doing something wrong, or if you think that there's public officials who are up to no good, that's very, very possible. It's usually not the public records officer who is the wrongdoer here. And so always kind of be kind and reasonable. You know, assert your rights. The public records law is sort of a right you have. It's not sort of them being nice to you. But don't be a jerk to them. Don't give them a hard time. At the federal level, for example, a lot of times it's the FOIA officers, like they're the ones who are like pushing internally to get stuff released, but they don't actually have access to those documents. They have to go out and convince other people within their agency to give some information out. And so if you want to get them to be your ally, you want to be understanding and sympathetic to them, so that they'll continue to work hard for you and go to bat to help raise the priority of your request. Somebody had a good question. Do some expressions or phrases help your case? A lot of times in the public records world, we're looking for sort of magic keywords, you know, sort of special language that'll help. The reality, unfortunately, is generally not. I think you want to keep your request specific. If there's a date range around your request, date parameters can help out a lot. Links we talked about can help out a lot, but there's no sort of like magic keywords. I think it's in general trying to make your request clear, make it concise, put together evidence that you can find that your documents actually do exist. And then also make sure, like, if you're asking for a fee waiver, look at what the fee waiver requirements are and just kind of clearly answer those all, right? I think do not sort of include sort of like general arguments that something's in the public interest in a very sort of like vague, this is for the good of society sense. Look at sort of how does that agency or how do those regulations define public interest and answer to that definition, right? I think we all have ideas about what public interest is and why our request is really important to get expedited. But you know, you should make sure you're actually kind of following sort of like what is that agency's guideline, because that's ultimately how they're going to evaluate it. Citing how you know that document exists gives you evidence as well. And so, you know, making sure you're sort of clear about that sort of thing. And then generally speaking, I think this isn't a magic keyword, but keeping things to one page whenever possible. Again, a lot of great questions. I am going to come back to them there. Oh, this is a good relevant one. So Jared said, I normally send my FOIA request in the body of an email. Is that preferred, or should I submit a more formal PDF as an attachment? Doesn't matter. That's a really good question. I think including your request in the body of the email is perfect. I know some people like having sort of like being able to use sort of formal letterhead. I think by and large email, as long as it's sort of like a short to the point email where they can kind of look at that email and see what is this person asking for, that is key. Because then if they want to turn that into a PDF, they will. I think the key thing here is just that agencies pass this material back around a lot, right? So I talked with the Department of Defense. They say the average FOIA request of the Department of Defense goes through 12 different people. And sort of you can keep your email so it's easy for them to forward on and pass around. And that if 12 different people are going to be forwarding this on an email chain, they can still zoom into your email and see exactly what you're asking for. That's the best format. Attaching something as a PDF to an email, agencies love doing that in responses. I don't think that helps out when you're filing your request with an agency. Great question. And going back to our next page of advice, assuming your request will get passed around. understand that the left hand often has no idea what the right hand is doing when it comes to requests. And what this means is like a lot of times sort of like you have somebody on the front line who's actually getting your request. They probably have no idea what you're actually asking about. They'll have no idea sort of like maybe that person who's receiving that request doesn't really understand technology because that's not their job. It's to process requests. So if you ask for something very technical or you ask for something very specialized, they probably don't know any more about it than you. And so you want to kind of arm them with the information that they'll need to kind of figure out who internally is the best person to actually answer that. Agencies usually love talking on the phone. This is just kind of a secondary thing, but a lot of agencies will want to say, hey, they'll be more candid on the phone. And so if an agency says, hey, do you have a few minutes to talk about your request? I always recommend taking them up on that offer and then just memorializing the outcome of that request. So right after you get off the phone with them, sort of saying, hey, thank you so much for the time on your phone. Just to kind of summarize our discussion, I said I would modify my request so that I'm only asking for 3 years instead of 5. And you said you could get me this data by next Monday or whatever else. Great. So the follow through, and I think a lot of these questions are going to come in with the follow through. So first thing with follow through is assuming good faith, right? I think sometimes agencies are doing the wrong thing. Sometimes agencies are lying or obstructing. Usually the problem, not always, but usually the problem is not with the FOIA officer themselves. And so I think when you start accusing the FOIA officer of like obstructing or being an idiot or being malicious, that's going to not help your request. Even if they are being malicious, if you accuse somebody of being obstructive or whatever else, just kill them with kindness. And sometimes, I grew up in Tennessee. Sometimes I break out my Tennessee accent and say, hey, I'm just trying to understand this. Oh, shucks, what's going on here? Why is it costing me $1,000 for some emails? And just asking them to like kind of walk you through that process. And sometimes stuff that feels like a few years ago, we asked for some emails. Agency said it's going to be cost hundreds of dollars. We hopped on the phone with them and they're like, well, I have to print them all out. Then I have to like fax them over to you. And that's going to take like a few hours. And we said, oh, did you know that you can like drag and drop emails from Outlook onto your desktop? And like the phone went silent for like 3 minutes. And like, they're like, oh my God, I had no idea you could do that. And then we got all of the emails for free like 10 minutes later, right? So a lot of times, unfortunately, FOIA officers don't have a lot of training. They don't have a lot of resources. They're given a lot of internal demands. And so talking through stuff, asking people like, hey, can you just explain why it's going to cost $300,000? Is there anything I can do to modify my request? That's usually going to be a much more useful approach for you. Letting agencies know when you expect a response. Again, that's not going to be super effective in actually getting them to hit that date, but it can help with negotiating, right? So if you say, hi, I'm working on this story, or hey, I've got this big presentation coming up. I really like these documents by next Friday. Then the agency says, well, I can't get you A, B, and C, but I can get you A, B, or C by Friday. And it can start a negotiation that can be very valuable. Always try and get an estimated completion date from agency. At the federal level, agencies are required to give you an estimated completion date. At the state and local level, usually they're willing to. And that can be very helpful in terms of getting them to, sort of have some internal deadlines that they can kind of work against. When you do get documents, do just keep in mind, I'm just going to be very brief on this, it's just like interviewing the responses because responsive records can lie too, right? Always be thinking through, how is this document generated? Who put this together? Like after action reports are kind of a famous example of this, where it's like after a police officer is involved in a shooting, they're going to have their union rep there helping them like talk through the answers. And so think through, how are these documents generated so that you can understand the biases. Maybe, for example, maybe there's a database that you got and it shows like 000 1 month for one of the fields. Well, that might be that there was 000 that month, or it might be that somebody was out on medical leave. And so thinking through how is data collected so that you can better understand sort of like, oh, don't just take that for granted. And then appealing. So somebody had the great question, do appeals ever work? What should I ask for, and how can I find more ideas for documents requests? Yeah, so appeals work a lot. So I think it was like about 25 to 30% of the time, appeals at the federal level result in more documents being released. And that even a lot of times works for when you get documents. You can say, hey, I think you didn't do enough of a search. Please search again. Appeals are very, very effective, but very, very few people file appeals. And so more people should file appeals just because you basically get a new set of eyes looking at your request. It's the last stage before litigation. And so agencies that might brush off your request know that like if they screw up this appeal, they're going to get sued. And if they get sued, they might have to pay court fees, or otherwise, you know, nobody likes getting involved in litigation. And so appeals can be really, really effective. They can also be really, really simple. When it comes to interpreting appeals, you don't need a lawyer. Agencies are supposed to give the most generous possible reading of the appeal. So they'll have somebody who's more experienced reviewing the appeal. And they're supposed to sort of interpret it as if it was the best possible written appeal. So even if you're not fully sure about sort of language or exactness, that's okay. Now, the one exception to this is if you're planning to litigate your request. So maybe you've been talking with a lawyer. Maybe you're like, okay, I know this is a request we really want to go far on. This is the last stage to kind of get legal arguments in. And so this is where you do want to start consulting with a lawyer. You do want to kind of make the very best argument. So we said on your initial request, keep it to less than a page. Don't mention like every extraneous legal theory you can. When it comes to the appeal, that's where you do want to get all of your legal arguments in there. I mentioned before, and I'll mention again, we have a guide to each state plus the federal law laws so that you can see what each of those laws look like. Also, that page, if you scroll down to the very bottom, we have an exemptions database with we got a few hundred sample appeals across each states so that you can sort of see, here's some sample appeal language you know, get really good ideas for sort of ways to kind of push back on exemptions. The Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press, who we're doing that Twitter webinar tomorrow with, they also have a really great open government guide where they have really detailed information on each state's levels, public records law. Those are both really, really valuable for appeals. One thing to keep in mind is that not each state has a appeals process. And so make sure that your state actually has an appeals process. That's something to keep in mind. One other resource I didn't include in this slide, but I should have, is FOIA.wiki, another really great resource from Reporters Committee, and we've helped collaborate on that. That's a really great guide for sort of appeals at the federal level. The Open Government Guide is just state and local resources. Great question from Chris. So Chris asked, what happens when an appeal forces release of the records and the AG office won't take enforcement steps? Is court action the only available step at that point? Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. So say you win an appeal and the agency still doesn't hand over the records. Unfortunately, you know, AGs usually are supposed to step in, or sometimes the Secretary of State is supposed to step in and actually enforce that appeal ruling. Some agencies will just say, no, like we're not going to do that, even though we lost the appeal. that's a really bad situation. And that's usually is the case where you do have to go to litigation at that point. Now, the good news is that a lot of states have attorney's fees. And if you've won an appeal and the agency is still refusing to process that request, there's a lot of really great pro bono resources out there. If you're a reporter, the Reporters Committee has a free hotline for newsrooms, but there's also a number of litigation funds that are specifically looking for really good cases, and a lot of pro bono attorneys that are interested in sort of taking on those kinds of cases, especially if you can show you've won that appeal and they're still refusing to answer. I think that's a time where it's a lot easier to find a pro bono attorney who's like willing to kind of look at your case and potentially take that on. Because when agencies just refuse to acknowledge appeals or appeals that they've lost, that's bad. Another really great question. Thank you to whoever asked this. Besides the New York Department of State's knowledge database, is there any other resource of precedents, et cetera, to use in appeals? So one good trend the last few years is that more and more Secretary of States are starting to post appeals and outcomes. In New York, there's the Committee on Open Government, has a really large sort of appeals and opinions database. That's an incredible resource if you're trying to file an appeal to look through. You can search through these databases and kind of say, oh, I'm asking for police records, search through, look for police outcomes, and get lots of great examples. So I don't know about most, but a lot of states now have databases of appeals and outcomes that you can look through. At the federal level, there's the Office of Government and Information Services. They're sort of an independent, thanks for letting me know about that, James, that the FOIA.wiki is down at the moment. I will check in with them and we'll see if we can help them get that back up and running. The Office of Government and Information Services has also a database of decisions that they've made. That's a really valuable resource because they not only include like, hey, we decided in this person's favor, but they include the decision process behind that. And that includes sort of like prior precedents that you can then cite and that sort of thing when you're filing your appeal. If you're filing through MuckRock, so we do have a service that helps people file public records requests. We've got a built-in sort of search tool that helps people go through our database. It can be really helpful when you're trying to like just quickly put out an appeal together. But that's also available at muckrock.com/place. Somebody asked to enter there any legal organizations besides MuckRock that will to assist with FOIA appeals. Great question. There are. So if you're a journalist, there's the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press. If you're not a journalist, National Freedom Information Coalition, your local organization, a lot of times they're super excited to hear from local residents who are filing public records of work, and there you don't have to be a journalist. So that's a really fantastic resource as well. There's also a growing network of legal clinics around the country. And so if you Google for sort of transparency legal clinics, First Amendment legal clinics, those are a really fantastic resource as well. And so there are more and more resources that are designed to kind of help out requesters. And it's a lot of times, if you have something that has a public interest in it, there's a lot of groups that want to do pro bono litigation out there for you. Same goes with suggestions for journalists who don't have dollars to go to court. Other steps you can take after an appeal fails. SPJ and National Freedom of Information Coalition have a fund that actually awards sort of court fees and that sort of thing to help you pursue litigation. And again, RCFP has a legal hotline, and there's a few other legal resources. I'll try and drop something later about a link for other resources that I can recommend. But short answer is there's a lot of lawyers out there who think this stuff is really important, and they're always looking for good cases. Legal clinics are looking for good cases. So there's options out there. Key considerations when putting together an appeal. Make sure the agencies are citing valid exemptions. This is particularly true at the state and local level, where agencies will just kind of make up their own exemptions. One of our favorite stories around here is a few years ago, one of our interns filed a public records request for a dolphin autopsy in New Jersey. And the state of New Jersey said that they couldn't release that information to protect the dolphin's medical privacy rights. Once you're dead, you don't have privacy rights. And if you're a dolphin, you don't have privacy rights. So it was very confusing when New Jersey came back and said, oh, dead dolphins have privacy rights. It turns out there was a larger sort of cover-up going on there. It is New Jersey. So when agencies cite stuff, if they cite a specific law or if they cite a case, just go through, quickly Google that, and make sure it passes the sniff test. Just because part of a document is exempt doesn't mean all of the document is exempt. Ask for segregable information. There's been times where an agency said, oh, this is exempt as trade information for some kind of report or something. And I said, well, at least the page numbers on that report are not going to be exempt. So if they have to reprocess that, you know, do push back when agencies say that that something is exempt. If you do a little bit of research, you will know the law better than the agencies. And so use those resources we mentioned, use MuckRock's guides, RCFP's guides. And if you do a little bit of research, a lot of agencies don't have a lot of FOIA training. They don't have a lot of resources internally. So maybe they heard this from their predecessor. I talked with one agency and they said, hey, this is the first FOIA request we got in 7 years. Please bear with us. And so it's not a lot of times. Sometimes it's malice. Sometimes it's like, this is just what they've heard in the past. So go and do your research. And a lot of times you'll know the agency better than they do. And sometimes materialism may withhold and higher level folks will overrule. And so this is where appealing can be really helpful. There's a lot of agencies, things that are say, you know, balance the public interest with the privacy rights. And sometimes kicking that up a higher level will get something released. Really good tip from Chris. In Massachusetts, if attorney-client privilege is claimed as an exemption, an attorney-client log is required to be provided, and that alone can be valuable. I really like that tip. I was not aware of that. So that's a really good tip. Chris said, we learned from the attorney-client log that elected official began negotiating contract on his own without full committee knowledge. That's a great example. I'd love to hear more about that later, Chris. That's really cool. So I think, So I think doing a little bit of research out there can sometimes turn sort of rejections into even more interesting stories than out there. Raymond message, per the precedents, et cetera, I found it useful to front load FOIA requests with previous FOIA decisions that speak to your request. In other words, give them the substance FOIA precedent to the initial FOIA request. I think that's a great suggestion. I think including like instances where this kind of material has been previously released can be very, very valuable. I think just be careful not to overload your request with a ton of legalese, but just say, you know, for reference, the Secretary of State found this material releasable in this decision, or like this agency previously released this data last year. That goes a long way towards having the agency feel confident that they can release something. So I think that's a really great tactic. Somebody asked, and I think this also, Congress compared to all other federal employees, right? So we have 3 branches of government: executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch. Congress and the judicial branch are officially exempt from FOIA, and the White House is also exempt from FOIA, which is kind of a bummer if you're a FOIA requester. And so Congress, you can't get anything out of them. Now, this is not true at the state level. At the state level, most agencies are subject to public records law. but at the federal level, Congress is exempt. If you're interested in which judiciaries and which Congresses are subject and which are not, we have all that listed at muckrock.com/place. So I do want to talk a little bit about that. And then somebody also mentioned privacy rights. How does that affect how to make a FOIA request, right? So we mentioned that post-Watergate, there was a Privacy Act filed or created. So one of the things, like if you're interested in records from Congress or another agency that's exempt, or if you're interested in records that involve an individual, right? So you can't file a request directly with Congress, but what you can do, for example, is say Congress got briefed by an agency, or say you're interested in sort of a congressman's interference with an agency. What you can do is you can go to that agency and say, hey, I want all communications with this congressperson. So you can go to a non-exempt agency and file further records in communications with that agency. And the same is true Privacy Act. So Privacy Act forbids agencies from releasing information that would violate people's privacy. But it gives people who are mentioned in those documents increased access. So if you're interested in the materials that an agency has on you, you should actually file a Privacy Act request with that agency and ask for, hey, I want all the information that this agency has on me. And you actually also have the right to get, if the agency has misinformation on you, you have the right to ask them to correct that information. If you're filing a request about somebody else, maybe it's somebody you've talked with before, you can actually ask them to file a privacy waiver, and then you can file a request on their behalf. And so Privacy Act can be an impediment to access sometimes, but also if you can work with a source, if you can work with the subject of an investigation, they can actually help you get increased privacy. The same is true. Somebody asked earlier about sort of college students or specific tips for college students. So all schools are subject to the Federal Educational Right to Privacy Act, which prohibits the release of a lot of academic related information and can make really higher education public records requests very challenging. But every student actually has the right to access their own educational records. And so if you're a student journalist, or if a student journalist or if you're a journalist reporting on education, you can ask a student, hey, file a FERPA request. And then if you're willing to share the results when they come back, that can help me get access to documents that otherwise just won't be accessible. And this even applies to private institutions as well. So FERPA actually gives students request extra access to stuff like that. So thinking creatively about sort of like, okay, the Privacy Act means this won't be released. FERPA means this won't be released. Are there other categories of records that can open up? Can I ask a source to waive their privacy rights for me? Or can I teach that source how to file a Privacy Act on their own? And if they get something interesting back, then maybe they can give that to me. So those are really, really good questions. What are some basics you'd recommend? So I do want to spend a little bit of time. I know we're blowing way past an hour, but I did want to talk about sort of thinking through coronavirus related requests, right? So what should local reporters be requesting in regards to coronavirus? So I think asking for emergency response plans, right? So I think coronavirus, somebody else pointed out the coronavirus is very bad, but fortunately it cannot read. So we don't have to worry about it knowing about our secret plans for responding to it. And so I think asking for response plans. I think one area, this goes back to sort of thinking like a middle manager, is what can we do to sort of get in the mind of a middle manager? How can we think through sort of the bureaucracy and sort of what are the needs and the goals and the priorities of this bureaucracy right now? And starting to think through like, okay, does the school have a pandemic plan? You know, who is trying to like get rich off this, right? So I think a lot of states have sort of price gouging rules in place? Can we ask for copies of sort of like, what are the price gouging referrals? I think there are a lot of agencies that are going to be very stressed right now. And so I think it becomes even more important to think through, how can I keep my request very discreet, specific, easy for them to fulfill? And then also think through sort of like, what are the kinds of materials that are going to be easy for them to access and provide, and provide some useful information. Yeah, so I think Wes just suggested also how the mandates from CMS requirement for emergency preparedness plan were successful, right? I think agencies for a year, part of their mandate has been prepared for pandemics. I think it's worth asking sort of like, you know, what have previous drills shown, and sort of how has reality kind of fallen off those prior pandemic plans. So if you can ask for sort of like prior pandemic plans, if you can use sort of like those Google techniques we talked about earlier to look for old pandemic plans, that'll give you ideas for sort of like how prepared, how well did they follow through. And then also for surveillance reports, right? So the Wall Street Journal just had a big story talking about all these surveillance vendors who are now trying to sort of implement their technology as sort of, you know, pandemic preparedness. So a few months ago, Beryl Lipton, one of our senior reporters working with OpenTheGov, found out about this company called Clearview AI that was secretly selling facial recognition technology to police departments around the country using sort of scraped social media data, very, very sketchy, and very, very few safeguards in place. Now Clearview AI is trying to pitch its gear, its software as like, oh, now we can help do contact tracing and all this other stuff. Anytime there is a disaster, a lot of people try and come in and sell snake oil to agencies. Sometimes that's snake oil, surveillance snake oil, sometimes that's other thing. And a surprising amount of agencies buy into it. And so I think this is a chance. I think agencies are saying transparency is not essential, but I think we've seen time and again how important it is for the public to have access to this information, so that we are providing a safeguard here. We've blown past time, and so I do want to make sure we give people a chance to kind of wrap up. Thank you everybody so much for coming today. This is a really great discussion. I hope you found it valuable. We have a Slack that's free. Anybody can join and kind of ask FOIA questions, that sort of thing. To sign up, just fill out the form at muckrock.com/Slack. Those are all manually reviewed, so it takes me a day or two to kind of send the invites out. But would really love to kind of keep the conversation going, answer more questions, and talk about the upcoming stuff we have going on with pandemic. If you work in a newsroom, we are looking for more newsroom collaborations and figuring out how we can provide our resources to other folks, particularly around coronavirus-related collaborations. You can email our project editor, Beryl, at muckrock.com, and we can forward that around internally. One last tip before we go from Raymond. Sometimes agencies will deny records requests if the record contains names, address, and social security numbers. In the case of FOIAs where you just want to compile statistics, it might be wise to proactively ask the agency to redact identifying information. This may increase the agency's comfort level and expedite the rest. Great suggestion. So basically that means if you're asking for a database and you're just like looking for survey level data, say, hey, anything that might be sensitive, feel free to just redact. One of the key lessons about FOIA is it's oftentimes a negotiation. And so anything you can do to kind of figure out what you actually care about and be willing to negotiate on the rest can go a long way. Again, thank you to everybody so much for all the amazing questions and for joining us today. Would love to kind of hear what you thought of this presentation. My email is just michael@muckrock.com. Would love to hear if this is valuable, what we can do in future presentations. We will be posting this recording online for later. And have a great day. Hope everybody has a wonderful Sunshine Week. And do join us for our Twitter chat tomorrow. Sunshine Chat 2020 is the hashtag, and we'll see you there. All right.